Chapter 2 of Go All-in-One, and that is hardware. All right, just a reminder, we are recording this for you guys. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so there are a whole bunch of different parts that go into a CPU, or not into a CPU, into a computer, into a PC, a personal computer, but not the CPU itself. I mean, there is a whole bunch of stuff there, but we're not getting that deep into that. So here I just have a list of all the parts. We are going to be going through these in a bit more in depth in a minute, all right? But I just like to kind of point out, roughly everything for you guys, all right? So starting off with right here, of course, that didn't work. There we go. Let's try this again. There we go. All right, starting off with right there. I'll put an arrow too because that's kind of thin. That would be your cooling. All right, but behind your cooling right there is your CPU. All right, and depending on if you're an Intel or an AMD person, the CPU is going to be slightly different. We'll talk about more of that in the next slide. Your motherboard is this whole box right here. All right, there's a big PCB or printed circuit board right there that has all of your required parts and pieces on there for your motherboard to work with things that are not going to be upgradable. For storage in this PC, down here in the bottom, we have one there, we have one here. But there are some of our storage capabilities. Those are going to be traditional hard drives looking at them. I don't see any conventional SSDs, and I also don't know if there are any M.2 slots on there, but we'll come back to those again later. Our GPU is probably this little guy right here. All right. So that would be our graphics processing unit. It looks like all of these cables that you're seeing right here are for extra USB ports, most likely. Our power supply is this box right down here on the bottom. And then obviously we don't have any peripherals in this because we don't see anything other than the actual computer tower. But anyway, let's get back to the actual parts and get a little bit more in depth on them. So first, we have our CPU, and up in this corner, I have a traditional CPU. That is traditional, but that is an Intel-based one. And if you look very closely, actually, at these pins here, all right, all that you see on there are a whole bunch of little dots, just all lined up, obviously nice and perfectly. In the center, there's a little bit different going on, but around the edge, it's lots and lots of little pins. All right, and all those is ways for the actual CPU to interact with your motherboard. So on the motherboard, if we look at a little cross-sectional view, you have a little spring like this, and again, you have a whole bunch of those lined up in the X and Y direction. And those match up with all those little pins. All right, so when you put your CPU down, all those little springs kind of compress a little bit, which gives you good pressure to keep everything connected. Most AMD processors actually have the pins on the CPU themselves actually sticking up, and then there's little sockets, little holes for them to go in on the motherboard. So not guaranteed, but you will see the springs or the pins on some are on the motherboard, some are on the CPU. It really mainly depends on the brand. All right. So there are 4 different tasks for this of the motherboard or the CPU. We have input, we have processing, we have output, and we have storage. All right. And that kind of goes along with what we have down here in this little picture. So we have this shows you the 4 store, fetch, decode, execute. All right. So our input would be our fetching. Then we move to decode for processing. Then we go to output, which kind of the executing, and then we go down to store. All right. So we kind of go through this loop of tasks. All right, and that's all it's basically doing. The CPU every cycle, it's going, hey, I need this information. I process it. I send that information out. I store what I need to. I grab more information, I process, I output, I store what I need to, and it just repeats over and over and over again. All right. We have our control unit, which is one of our larger parts of the CPU. All right, and that is there for coordinating the movement of data through the CPU. And then right next to that, which is the execute part, is our arithmetic/logic unit. And this is what actually performs the arithmetic and the logic. So this is what's actually doing the main work on the computer. All right. So it's kind of two different big units of part of that. We do have clock speeds. All right, for CPUs, you will hear them in the terms of gigahertz. All right. So you may hear 2.4 gigahertz or something like that. Wow, that's a horrible. Here we go. And that is the frequency at which the CPU is going to be running processes. All right. So that is something to keep your eye open for, is how fast your CPU is. Now, this is not a perfect solution in the long run, but it is getting you a good understanding of what your computer's doing. And what that gigahertz is, or what hertz is times per second. So basically, it's how many instructions per second can your CPU handle. So if you're running at 3.4 gigahertz, that's 3.4 thousand, or sorry, million billion. Giga is billion, my bad. 3.4 billion instructions per second. All right, and you probably will see your clock speed on your computer be varying up and down some. All right, I've just opened up. Let's go ahead and hit. Give me a second. Go ahead and hit that button. All right, you guys should now be able to see my task manager for my computer. So if we look at my CPU information, we have it is an Intel Core i7-8700K at 3.7 gigahertz. So that is its base speed. All right. Now, the speed of the processor can go below that. It can go above that. It really depends on the situation, but its base speed is 3.7 gigahertz. The other thing that you might notice or you might hear about on your computer is cores. All right, and the cores is how many of those little processors are actually on your CPU. All right. If we look at mine again, I have 6 different cores on my PC. Now you might be asking, why do I have 12, or why do I have 12 logical processors? And that's because of hyperthreading. And that is basically taking one core and splitting it into 2 separate cores, both running in theory at the same max speed, but it is not a perfect solution. It's not truly duplicating things. One core to look like 2. Yep, someone said one core to look like 2. So yeah, it kind of looks like 2. You're depending on the situation you're in, you may get lots of benefits by having hyperthreading enabled. It may not be a huge benefit, but it's more often than not, hyperthreading is going to be a good thing for you. So you normally do want to have that enabled. This is one of those things that you can disable in your BIOS of your motherboard. But again, most people, they're not going to do it. You're going to say, okay, I have a single core, or I have one core, I want it to be 2 cores. It's going to give me a little bit of better performance coming out of this. So you may hear that. Dual and quad core are definitely basically standard nowadays. All right. I'm not saying that that is a guaranteed that you're always going to see a dual or a quad core processor out there. But it is definitely something that you may be seeing pretty often in the long run happening on your computers. Even cell phones nowadays, oftentimes you'll see that your cell phone, even mid phones, have like 8 core processors built into them. Now, 4 of those cores are normally performance cores, and 4 of them are normally efficient cores type of thing. Not going to be as high performance wise, but they're going to have high efficiency. So we can actually disable the performance cores when you just need a little bit of computational power. But when you need a lot of computational power, it'll actually go to those higher performing cores. So that's really kind of an interesting thing, in my opinion, that we are kind of jumping around in that world. However, just because dual and quad is the standard, that doesn't mean that's where we're at. I mean, I have, as you guys saw, a 6-core, 12-thread processor. You can now, with Threadripper and high-end server-grade hardware and things like that, you start seeing 50 core processors, 60 core processors with 128 threads, or sometimes even more than that. And some motherboards will actually have 2 sockets on them, so they can put 2 different processors. This is mainly the server area, but 2 different processors, and you get double the cores and double the thread count that way. So you can get extremely high processing power that way, which, man, it's really kind of impressive in the long run with how much processing power and things like that you can get nowadays for not all that much. Now, your motherboard. We have a whole bunch of different parts and pieces to this motherboard. All right, the first, as we said, is going to be your CPU socket, or as I kind of talked about already. Go back. I draw now. There we go. All right, so our CPU socket, as I'm pointing to right here. Now, this one is an LGA 1150. I believe that 1150 is how many pins the processor, the socket has in this case, but I'm not positive of that. And that number right there in the center, that's going to change depending on which motherboard you get, which processor you buy, those types of things. The big important thing here is make sure your motherboard and your processor are compatible and that the sockets actually match. You can't change the socket later after the fact. You can change the processor, but you can't change the socket. So you do want to make sure that those do actually match up for you. Otherwise, it's going to cause some problems in the long run. So please be careful of that one. All right. Next thing on the list I have is PCI. All right. PCI stands for. I want to make sure I get this right. I always do this up. Peripheral Component Interconnect. All right. So PCI Peripheral Component Interconnect. All right. And as you can see down here, there are a whole bunch of them. In our case, oh, and there's even one more right there. All right, and if you do look really closely at these, you can see that one says 16, this one just says PCI 1, this PCI 2, 16, 16, those types of things. And this is kind of an important aspect of it. You can get lots of add-in cards and things like that for computers, for graphics, for audio, for memory, for all sorts of different things at this point in time. So you do want to make sure, again, that you have the right slot for that type of PCI card that you're going to be adding to it. All right. Next we have on the list is RAM, which are over here. Now, they won't always be in this all these things aren't always going to be in this order. These are a rough location for you. All right. Traditionally, you do have the CPU kind of above the PCI slots. This would probably be what's called an ATX motherboard. All right. But I'm not guaranteeing that at this point. They do have micro ATX and there's a whole bunch of different size motherboards, and really that just it depends on how big, physically large the motherboard is. The larger the motherboard, obviously, the more PCI slots and things like that we can fit on them. However, sometimes you don't need a large motherboard. If you're like, all I'm going to do is put a GPU in one slot, and that's all I'm going to need, you can get micro ATX, which just has one PCI slot for GPU, and that's going to be the end of it. So we don't need all this extra space down here at the bottom. We could move the important things up and maybe cut the motherboard off, like at this point type of thing. So there's a little bit of give and take going on there. Your RAM. All right, we have that listed over here on the side. And if we do look very carefully again at these, you can see we have A1, A2, B1, B2. All right. So RAM has channels, all right, which is how it is accessing the memory. RAM is random access memory. All right, this is something that you're not going to be storing things on in the permanent aspect of things. We will come back and talk about RAM more in a little bit. But anyway, while I have this up, I do want to point out that you can have dual channel, you can have quad channel, you can have multi-channel RAM, which is just grouping your RAM sticks into multiple sets. So normally you want to use, if you're going to have a single RAM stick, you'd use A1. Why sometimes it lets me draw and sometimes it moves. We would use A1. If you're going to have two RAM sticks, you want to use A1 and B1. You'd actually want to put them in two different channels, so that way it has more bandwidth to be able to access all of that. You really don't want to do a three RAM stick setup. That's just going to kind of throw things off balance and those types of things. But I just kind of do like to point that out, that you do have that option. All right. Someone asked, what does PCI look like? All right. If you give me a second, I will pull this up for you. I'm going to have to go disable something. And let's just throw this here. And there we go. Here we have the PCI. So this would probably be, I have no clue what this is. And these are actually probably slightly older models. But you can see this is what the PCI slot looks like. And then this is what a card looks like that you could add into that PCI slot. All right. And again, you need to make sure that these are matching, because you can get some shorter PCI slots that look like this that only need the 1x slot. Or you can get the longer ones that need the 16x slot, or all those types of things. And depending on what you're plugging in is really what matters. All right, so here you can see we have a PCI 2 32-bit, we have an Express 1, an Express 16. So for the most part nowadays, we're running PCIe on newer computers. But here, this is only a 1x slot, so that only uses one channel of the available PCI interface that goes straight to the CPU. This one is a 16x slot, so it's using 16 times more of that bandwidth that goes to that PCI, or to the CPU. So very important. Yes, PCI is Peripheral Connection Interface or Component Interconnection. One of those two. All right. So it's that there is a this is there's a PCI 2.0 and there's a PCIe. All right. All right. So going back to what does PCI do? Someone asked. PCI is just a way for you to add more capability to your computer. All right. Actually, if I go back to this video, so here we can see we're adding what's called FireWire, which was supposed to kind of replace USB to some people's opinions. Here we have a TV tuner card, so you could actually bring antenna TV into your computer. You can do Ethernet, you could do Wi-Fi, those types of things. PCIe is going to be a lot faster than USB, and I do talk about that in a later slide. But it's just another interface other than USB that just gives us a lot more higher bandwidth, so a lot more carrying capacity than what USB would offer. So PCI. All right. So yeah, so RAM, you do want to make sure you get your RAM sticks in the right slots. There is going to be a power port on here, and on this one, this motherboard, it is over here. I'm going to go to the next slide because it didn't. There we go. There's our main power port. And this is going to be a 24 pin. All right. And that's going to have voltages of 3.3, 5 volts, 12. I think it's plus or minus all of those. So you could have a positive 3.3 and a negative 3.3. We also on this one have a 12 volt power pin at the top, which is supplemental power for that CPU. So it allows your CPU to draw more power possibly. All right. Not saying it's absolutely necessary. This one has an 8-pin. You can get some that are 4 pins. Sometimes you have multiple 4-pin connectors or 8-pin connectors, so you can get enough power to run that CPU. Normally that's a bigger issue for overclocking and things like that. But if you have that capability, you do want to make sure that you actually plug it in. Down, where are they? Over here on the side, I believe it is, right here, we have what's called our SATA connections. All right, and this is our older interface to our hard drives, those types of things. We will come back to, yeah, we'll come back to those in the storage section of this. This motherboard picture does not show an M.2 slot. All right, I think I have a picture of one later on. So again, we'll come back to that one. I/O, so inputs and outputs, right here along the bottom. We have all of our inputs and outputs. You'll notice that we have some USB headers. All right, so for plugging USB into. This would be our front panel connector. So for your power button, the status LEDs, the USB on the front, those types of things would all get plugged in, or not the USB. The USB would go to one of those, but those types of things would be on your panel connector. We do also have up here, right there, we have fan connectors. If you notice, they're all over the place. All right. Oh, wait, sorry, this does have an M.2. Right here, there is our M.2. All right. And that is a PCI-based PCI-based memories or storage option. All right, and that's a large, thin card that kind of looks like a stick of gum. And again, I'll show one to you later. But it would kind of plug in there like that and lay flat on the motherboard. Great, I didn't realize that was there. You also do have, so these are all of our I/O headers. Oh, the other I/O is all up here. All right, and we'll pull another slide up for that in a minute, showing you the kind of a back panel for a CPU or for a motherboard. Headers were down there. BIOS and Cmos. All right, one of the important things for your Cmos, all right, is let me quick go back to this. All right, so BIOS is the chip on the motherboard that is read-only or ROM. All right, so you have ROM, which is read-only memory, and you have RAM, which is random access memory. So don't get those two confused. But your BIOS is going to be non-volatile. So that means it does not forget when you lose power. So if you turn your computer off, you unplug it, your BIOS will still be there. It's what allows your computer to actually boot. All right. However, you also have some CMOS, or some complementary metal oxide semiconductors. And this is for storing information on your motherboard related to the settings. All right. So your BIOS is the heart and soul of the motherboard, which allows it to actually boot up. But then it actually goes to your CMOS, and it actually grabs settings from what you've used in the past to boot your computer. So do you want to boot to your first hard drive or your second hard drive? Which video output do you want to use? How much RAM is installed? All those types of information. How much voltage are you going to send to your CPU? Well, this just kind of the list goes on and on and on. Now, the biggest issue slash benefit of CMOS is it is volatile memory, which means if you turn off power, it will forget. All right, and that is where, and I'm going to click again. I'm trying to draw on the screen. It sometimes thinks I'm clicking. That takes you to this little battery. So you have a little CR2032 or something like that size battery on motherboards, which help keep that CMOS from forgetting. Now, you may say, why is that a good thing that the CMOS can forget? And that's if your computer crashes, like if you tweak something in your BIOS that gets saved to your CMOS and your computer just bites the dust, all right, being able to make your CMOS forget that you change that setting, go back to stock settings, will save your computer theoretically. So it'll allow you to actually boot your computer again. Oftentimes there is on the headers down here at the bottom, is a little button or a place that you can connect two wires together to ground out to reset your CMOS. But if not, you can always take that battery out. All right, so that's kind of your big overview of a motherboard. All right. No questions continuing. So here we have some ports that you may see on the back of a motherboard. So on the far right over here, we have your audio interface. All right. Traditionally, this green one is probably the main one that you're going to use. And that is your front left and your front right speakers. All right. So that's just a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack. You all should have seen one of those. But that handles 2 channels of audio. Now, if you want to have surround sound or back speakers or other things, that's when you start adding in these other connections. All right. One of these, I believe it's this red one. I always forget this. That's going to be your mic. So that's actually what I'm recording with. I have a microphone plugged into the back of my motherboard. And then you have, rear left, rear right in one port. You have a subwoofer. You have maybe a front channel, and then maybe some other channels. But anyway, 2, 4, 6, 8. You have like an 8 point, no, probably a 9.1. I don't know, somewhere in there. 7.1 surround sound probably with what's going on here, maybe a little bit higher. But anyway, that is our audio. We have blue USB ports here. All right, and if you don't know, blue is USB 3. All right. These black ones over on the far left-hand side, those are USB 2. All right, so you just do have to kind of keep those, be aware of that. Any like external USB drives, devices like this, especially if they do have the little blue plug as inside of them. So if you look inside that USB cable, you can see this says USB 3. If I plug this into a USB 3 interface, I'll get much higher transfer speeds out of it, and if I go to a USB 2. So there is a bit of a give and take going on there. Now, this motherboard does have 3 different video outputs on it. All right, now these are only good if your CPU has a built-in graphical processing unit or GPU. All right, so you do want to make sure if you're going to try to use these, that whatever CPU you have actually does take advantage of that. So that is something to look at. But anyway, we have a VGA at the top here. Traditionally, that is going to be a blue connector. I don't know why it is not in this instance, but typically it's going to be blue. We have a white DVI down here, right? And then we also have HDMI over here. All right, so we have 3 different options in this case. And then on the far left, we have right here, this is actually a optical audio. So this is actually a fiber optic base, so it's using light pulses to send audio out. I've rarely ever seen anybody actually use that. I know it exists. I know there's cables for it. I have a cable somewhere around for it, but I don't have anything that I can plug that into. So I understand why they include it on there, but I've never actually seen it used. And this last one, this is kind of years past, which is what's being shown here. This is what's called a Ps2 port. Now, it's not the gaming system. All right. It's a peripheral service, or did I write it down? No, I did not write down what Ps2 stands for. Let's give that a quick Google. Is a 6-pin mini DIN connector used for connecting keyboards and mice. It is the Personal Systems 2 from IBM is where that comes from. Normally, you do have a keyboard, which is the purple side, and a green, which is the mouse side one. But nowadays, very few people are actually using these things. So I think they just said, you know what, we're not going to put them on there at all. So, PS2. So, but that's like an old school mouse and keyboard. Some people will say that that's going to be your best option for interacting with your BIOS because there's no drivers at all that need to get loaded for your BIOS to actually interact with that. So, that may be your best option. Traditionally, your PS2 mice are going to have that old school ball in them. They're not actually going to be the optical mice that we're all used to nowadays. But it is there. So if you're ever having issues accessing your BIOS with like a USB keyboard and mouse, you really want to use a PS2 keyboard. That would be your best option there. At the bottom here, I have two more types that you might USB port or two more ports that you might see. I have a little USB-C type connector on there. All right, this would be USB 3.1, I believe that is. All right, many of you know this is kind of the way of the future at this point. You have high power delivery capabilities. I believe it's up to like 200 watts that you can deliver power over a USB-C cable. So a lot of lightweight laptops like Chromebooks and things like that are going to those for charging capabilities instead of their custom plugs or the barrel connectors. But we also get high-speed data, and you also can have what's called Thunderbolt over that, which again we'll talk a little bit more about later. All right, so you can get lots and lots of data going through those. And the last connector you might see sticking out is right here, and that's going to be your Wi-Fi antenna. So if your computer has built-in Wi-Fi, you'll see a connector like that, which will allow you to hook your antennas to it. So, any questions? Not at this point. Okay. So this takes us back to RAM. All right, and we already hit it up. RAM is random access memory. All right. This is going to be volatile storage, which means when you turn power off to your computer, whatever is in your RAM gets forgotten. All right, again, overall, that's a good thing. All right, it actually used to be standard practice that you would want to actually turn your computer off for like a few minutes every day. Just let it sit there to make sure your RAM was completely erased. Because oftentimes having some program or something would get stuck in memory, which would cause all sorts of problems and be bad news. So not something that we'd really want to do. So you used to actually have to turn your computer off and let it just sit there, let your RAM all forget everything, and then turn it back on. All right. However, nowadays that's not as big of an issue. I do still suggest that you reboot your computer at least once a week. Probably more I'll prefer would be once a day would be a much better option. We have DIMM versus SODIMM. So DIMM is dual inline memory module, which would be what you have here. All right, and then this one over here would be our SODIMM, which would be a small outline dual inline memory module. So these are going to be used in laptops and things like that, anywhere space is going to be more of an issue. All right, um, so we have cache memory, which is frequently accessed information. So it's where you'd store frequently accessed information, and it works faster speed than other types of memory. And you want to really get that closer to your CPU when possible. And the last thing I want to talk about is upgradability. Now, these RAM sticks, if you have these in your computer, they are so stinking easy to upgrade. You take the back of your laptop off, and oftentimes you'll see them there. And they're just there's like a little switch on both sides that you just kind of spring out to the side. They are spring loaded, and the module will actually then like tip towards you, and you can just kind of pull it straight out, and then you can pop a new one in. So if you ever like, my computer's starting to run slow, or you bring up your task manager, all right, and you're like, wow, I'm using all of the memory that I have. Maybe it is time to upgrade your RAM. So again, here I pulled up my CPU monitor. My computer has 16 gigs of memory in it. Do you need 16 gigs of memory? No. All right. I would not go less than 4 gigs of memory at this point in my life if I'm buying a new computer. I really wouldn't even go less than 8. I'd say 8 to me would be the bare minimum if I'm buying a traditional Windows laptop. You can see that I am using, if we look over on the left-hand side, 6.5 gigs of my RAM. So if I only had 8 gigs, I'd only have 1.5 gigs free. All right, and I open up some pretty memory intensive or some pretty RAM intensive applications like Photoshop or Autodesk Inventor or things like that, and all of a sudden my memory is going to skyrocket. So one of the reasons that I do have 16 gigs of memory in my computer. In a Windows or in a desktop PC, mainly Windows. I know, I don't Linux. I don't know about Macs. Again, I don't really deal with Macs. Um, you're gonna have your RAM stick. Man, go back. You're gonna have your RAM stick, and there'll be a little tab on both sides traditionally that you'll want to push kind of out to the side. And again, this will actually physically lift your RAM module up. And then when you go put it back in, you actually want to listen for a click. You see these little notches right here on all of these? All right, there is actually like a little hook that will go into those. And that's actually what you're pulling out. So when you pull this out that way, it'll unhook and then it'll actually then push up on the bottom of your RAM module to pick it up. So when you're putting a piece of RAM back in, make sure you really get it down real good. Make sure you see those little normally white or black levers stick back into the RAM, and normally you'll hear a click, one for each side. All right. Ideally, you're pushing right in the middle and you'll hear both clicks at the same time, but normally that's not going to be the case, at least from my experience. Right. But it's really easy to upgrade your RAM. And oftentimes it's cheaper for you to buy a computer with base model RAM, buy 8 gigs, 16 gigs of RAM, and then replace it yourself than it is to just buy buy it from the store. And it's like, and I still have the 4 gigs of RAM or whatever that you could then hopefully sell or whatever with. So that is something to look into. A lot of smaller motherboards, those micro ATX and things like that, maybe stuff from like HP and whatnot, they may only have 2 slots for RAM. But oftentimes motherboards do have 4, and they'll only put it in 2. Every once in a while, they'll see it only having 1 stick of RAM, but normally you have 2 sticks of RAM. So you could always buy like an 8 gig kit, and instead of just having 8 gigs of RAM, you have the 4 that came with your computer. Slap 2 more 4 gig sticks in, and you now have 8 gigs, or now have 12 gigs of RAM. So that is something to kind of think about, and I do highly suggest that you actually look into your RAM. It's a very easy upgrade. Just make sure that you are grounded when you are doing this, because some sparks or some, it can damage your motherboard if you short circuit something or whatnot. So be careful. And always question that I always get is, how much RAM do you need? All right. And this is just a nice little chart that tells you that Windows 10 at a high resolution, if you need a minimum of 2 gigs for that. Now, if you're going to have some Microsoft Profession stuff, Office, like Word, Excel, PowerPoint, you're only going to have 2 gigs for that. If you have Microsoft Edge open running, you're going to want 1 gig for that. Say you're listening to music and iTunes, you need 12, and then for Photoshop Elements, they suggest 4. That means in theory, and that for an ideal world, you want at least 11 gigs of RAM for using this computer. Now, many of you may not be running the Photoshop, and you may not be running iTunes, but maybe you have Spotify or something else open in there that's still going to need some RAM. And instead of Edge, you have Chrome or whatever. So no matter what, 7 gigs, if we get rid of Elements, right, that takes us down to 7 gigabytes. That's pushing that 8 gig limit. So if you don't, if you're not being careful, or you have a lot of tabs open or something like that, it's very easy to have your RAM be getting maxed out. And then you have to start going into virtual RAM, which I don't have listed on this slide. It's either later in this PowerPoint or in the next one. Next, we get into some internal storage, and there are overall 3 different classifications of storage for long term. We have our traditional hard drive here. All right. Sometimes you'll hear this called spinning rust. All right, and I actually did take a hard drive apart at home so I could show you guys. I don't know. There it is. Let's just zoom you in real good. All right, so there is actually the inside of a hard drive. All right, a traditional hard drive, and the reason they call it spinning rust is because there is physically a metal disc that actually has your data on it. Now that I've opened this one, it's basically worthless. All right. There's all sorts of dust particles and my fingerprints all over this now. So this hard drive is basically worthless, which I'm not worried about because it's still using the old IDE connector on the bottom there. So wasn't planning on ever using this hard drive again anywhere. But we do have a this way, an actual spinning piece of metal. All right. And then we have a little seek head here, which when you're trying to actually access data, will spin down. That's not great sound. And then so that way it's actually reading small little magnets of zeros and ones. So if it's magnetized or not magnetized type of thing is what that head is reading, and it's actually able to write that as well. All right. And then so this can go in and out. trying to do this all based on the camera, which is kind of fun. There we go. You can see how that can move around to actually then read different places on the head here. All right, and it goes off to a park location to protect the hard drive in case of shocks and things like that when possible. All right, so traditional hard drive. Let's go ahead and zoom you back out. That then leads us to SSDs, all right, which is what you're seeing right here next to it. Back. All right here next to it. Now, this is still SATA based. So SATA is our current our current form factor for accessing traditional hard drives. All right. I also should mention this is what's called a 3.5 inch, and this is a 2.5 inch. All right, and that's basically from side to side here. And there is a standard length as well. I don't remember what it is. So traditionally, this is what you would have saw in laptops. All right, laptops nowadays are actually getting away from the little 2.5 inch, and they're most trying to go to this NVMe storage right here, or built-on memory to like Chromebooks and things like that. Something that you can't upgrade. All right. So your traditional hard drive over here, the spinning Rust, it's going to have the most capacity for the dollar. I bought a 4 terabyte internal drive like this for like $80 or something like that. I mean, 4 terabytes, that's more than I should ever use. However, I have lots of videos and things like that. And every year I take more and more pictures, and I have 2 kids. I'm constantly taking pictures. So that's filling up rather quickly in the long run. This is going to be a bit on the slower side though. All right. And I think I do have some, I have some read speeds later. So our SSD, all right, this is a solid state device, so it's completely flash based, just like your little USB flash drives that you might use consistently. All right. And again, you can get those in pretty large capacities. But again, the price is going to be a lot higher for one of these. So that is something that you do want to keep in mind. Now, when it comes to power, temperature, and audio, noise, the SSD is better on all fronts. All right, so there is a lot going for the SSD the SSD type of hard drive over the spinning Rust hard drive. But again, when it comes to like storage capacity, it's hard to beat one of these bad boys. And then our last one over here on the far right, this is that M.2 that I talked about earlier. So this is one of the newer form factors for SSDs. There is 2 different types of M.2s. One is an NVMe, which is non-volatile memory express. All right, so this is actually a PCI-based interface, and then you also have a SATA-based M.2. And the easiest way to tell is by looking at this edge connector. I forget which is which. I think that one is NVMe, and the SATA ones are kind of look like this. All right, so they'd have another little gap right here, I believe. So that's SATA ones. Don't quote me on which one's which. Make sure you look that up. But that's definitely one of the easier ways to determine which one is which. Now, if we want to quick talk about speeds here, a traditional hard drive spinning at 7,200 RPM. Yes, there are different RPM values for hard drives, so that is something that you do want to look into, especially if you're worried about speed. It should say it on the cover, but I'm not seeing it at a quick glance here. Is what I'm trying to find. But that's okay. So at 7,200 RPM, you're roughly looking at some read and write speeds between 80 and 160 megabits per second. All right. Yes, I did say bits, not bytes. All right. SATA 3 SSD, your read-write speeds are up to 550 megabytes per second. So you're looking at 4 to 7 or 8 in the speed upgrade from an SSD to a hard drive. So that is a big chunk of boost in read-write speeds, which will help your computer perform a lot better. So that is something to think about. Some companies who have standard replacement timeframes for computers, which traditionally I think at a company is like 3 to 4 years is how often they replace computers. They actually found they can get away right now is instead of replacing the computer completely, if it has a traditional hard drive in it, they can actually just upgrade the RAM, say double the RAM, some 4 gigs to 8 gigs, and put an SSD in it. So maybe $200 total for that upgrade, and they get another 3 to 4 years of life expectancy out of that, which I find to be awesome. All right, so big money saver for them in the long run. So that is just something that they do need to think about. But again, that is like a one-time thing. They can't constantly be doing that. Once they do it once, they're done. And most newer computers, I think, are coming with SSDs in them traditionally. All right, so this one we'll just call with. We'll just say this is 100. We said this was 550, and this last one is 3500. All right, so we had a 5 times difference between these, and from here to here we have almost a 7 times. All right, so again, huge jump in speed to go from a SATA to a PCIe based read-write speeds. All right, so that is definitely something that you want to take into mind there. Now, some speeds and feeds for you guys. PCI 4, all right, which is what we're getting to. So let's go back. Let's go to PCI 3. That is 100. Oh no, 1 gigabit per lane. All right, so if you have a PCIe 1X slot, you can get 1 gigabit of data transfer over that. And if you go up 16 or 8, or 4X, 8X, 6X, 16X slot, you're starting to get extreme amounts of data capacity that we can send over that. I want to say these are by 4, but I'm not positive on that. So what I mean by 4 is that means this is a 4X lane. So that means in theory max speed would be 4 gigabits, which I mean that's a little bit over this 3500 mark, so which would make sense. If we go to PCI Gen 4, it's actually almost 2 gigabits per second per lane. So again, huge jump. SATA 3 maxes out at 6 gigabits, so in theory we should be able to get much higher read-write speeds than this. I don't know why we're not. USB 2, we're looking at 480 megabits per second. USB 3, we can get up to 5 gigabits. So again, huge jump depending on which port you plug your external hard drives into. So that is definitely something you want to keep in mind. All right. Now, the USB port isn't everything, because if this is a spinning disk and you have a spinning disk in your computer, obviously that's going to reduce your max speeds anyway, but it still might be over 480 megs. And USB 3.1, that USB-C connector, that would be about 10 gigabits per second. Thunderbolt 2, we're rocking 20 gigs. And Thunderbolt 3, we're at 40 gigs. All right, so again, a lot of processing speed there. So USB 3 definitely is pretty much standard. So of those numbers, I'd say SATA is pretty standardized at this point, which is 6 gig. PCI 3 is 1 gig, and that's per lane. USB 3 is, I'd call that a standard at this point. So we're looking at 5 gigs there, up to 10, depending on if it's 3 or 3.1. And I think Thunderbolt 3 is standardized at this point. But even if we just go Thunderbolt 2, that was 20 gig. So, lots and lots of different differences there. Now, this is all internal storage. So this is all things that you would physically mount inside of your computer. All right. That takes us to the next one, which is external storage. All right. So you do have some hard drive based external storage, which is what I've been showing you guys in my hand here. All right. This is an actual 2.5 inch normal hard drive in this enclosure. I can hear it spin up when I plug it in. But you also do have eSATA, which is the little SATA port actually sticking out on the back of the motherboard. You will see that on some laptops, but traditionally it's more of a desktop thing, and I think that's overall like on the wayside. It was all hot news for a while, but I've never really seen anyone actually use it. USB obviously is a big one there. FireWire was another one that was around for a little bit, and I think it's overall outdated. And Thunderbolt. So Thunderbolt, definitely kind of one of the new hot topics out there. Now, for flash-based storage, these are going to probably connect via USB. And we have, your traditional little thumb drive here. But you also do have SD cards, compact flash, memory sticks, and I forget what the XD stands for. Up here, I'm showing you. So we have compact flash right there, a normal SD card here, a micro SD there. This one is definitely pretty standard at this point. A lot of cell phones and things like that have a slot for them. My laptop has a little dedicated spot for that. I much prefer the ones that have the full-size SD card slot, because you can always get little adapters to go to micro. You can't go. It's very much harder to go from micro to full than full to micro. And then your other external storage, which again is kind of past its prime, is CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays. All right, they're still around, and I don't have the different sizes written down for these. CDs roughly maxed out at like 700 megabits. DVDs, you do have single and dual layer, which I think was 4 and 8 gigs respectively. So it's 4 for a single, 8 for a dual. And Blu-ray, I actually have no clue what that number is. I think it's like kind of through the roof, if I remember correctly. So something to think about. That takes us to GPUs. All right. So your GPU may be built into your CPU, which is what I am showing you down here in this little picture on the left. All right. This I think I either took out of your book or the previous gen's book. But you can see how all of the data from the CPU, which is the orange, and the video data that's processing through the yellow, we're having a slow overall speed. You'll see a very low frames per second. Somebody told me that Blu-ray is 25 gigs. So again, like compared to Blu-ray, even double layer, that's I'm sorry, compared to DVD, even double layer, that's 3 times the speed. But anyway, GPU, if it's built into your motherboard or into your CPU, and that's on the same die as your CPU, it gets the job done, is what I will say. All right, my laptop here has the GPU built into it, and it can get the job done. It's not the best, but it gets done what I need, and that's really what they're meant for. They're not meant to be these super high-end processing that you can get 150 frames per second when you're playing video games on them, or extremely smooth renders when you're doing rendering stuff with CAD and things like that. But it will get the job done most of the time. Over here, you can see that without our GPU, with our GPU being its own separate device, like the one that's shown right here, we have a much higher processing speed. So we're actually taking a lot of load off of that CPU. And not only is it load, we're taking heat away. And heat is our arch enemy here. All right, we want to keep our temperatures down so our processing speed stays up. CPUs most of the time are designed and have safeties built into them where they won't physically let them get too hot. And just so you guys know, traditionally 100C is when we hit that too hot point. All right, sometimes it's 105, sometimes it's 95, but normally 100C, that's a good rough estimate. So taking that GPU work off, allowing it to go here, I mean, you can see how much cooling this GPU has on it, for just this one little portion of this. So GPU is going to be important. And this is going to, the whole point of this, main point I should say, is for creating video output. The other thing that GPU is really good for is crunching numbers, which is where I have mining listed up here on the left. You might have heard of Bitcoin mining and things like that. So that is when they're just constantly doing all sorts of crazy calculations and things like that. And that's where the Bitcoin craze kind of came in. And man, video cards used to get be stupidly expensive, and they are still stupidly expensive because of that mining craze. It's kind of crazy in the long run. But so ideally, a separate GPU is definitely going to be better than one built into your CPU, but built-in is still an acceptable answer depending on what you're trying to get done. So that is something that you do want to think about. Now, some GPU port examples that you might see I have listed up here. So probably most common today that you will definitely see all over the place is going to be HDMI. That one is probably the most used. All right, and the really interesting thing to me is between HDMI and DVI, the only real difference here is audio. HDI carries audio with it, where none of these other ones do, where DVI does not. All right, so that's one of the big differences. Otherwise, HDMI and DVI are basically the same thing. This is just a different plug. You do have a dual link DVI versus a single link DVI. You can also see there's a slight difference right here. This normal DVI allows you to adapt to things like VGA and HDMI and things like that really easily, where a dual link does not as much. All right. We also do have DisplayPort, which might be the future of video. This might be replacing HDMI. Now, I don't know if it's going to replace it on like a DVD player or things like that, but when it comes to the computer world, DisplayPort is definitely starting to kick butt. And you might see this mini DisplayPort here on your laptop or things like that. Yeah, the amount of bandwidth and like your resolution and frames per second that DVI can do compared to HDMI is much higher. So that's why the DisplayPort is kind of winning that game right now. When it comes to your power supplies, ratings is going to be king. All right, so you'll hear a power supply rated at 80 plus, and as you can see here, I have a whole bunch of different ones. It's basically all it is efficiency. Is how efficient do you need your power supply to be? So at 20% load versus 50% versus 100%. So really, you don't want to go too large on your power supply, because if you do, you're only going to be sitting at the 20% mark, and you're going to have a lot poorer efficiency than if you're sitting at the, say, 50% mark. All right, now a lot, in this case, it's like 2-3% overall, but still, that's some efficiency that you're just wasting as heat. So you really want to size your power supply accordingly. And those are going to be rated in wattage. So you might hear 550 watts or 1,000 watts or 700 watts or, one of those things. So that is definitely the game. And though always the question is, how many watts do I need? All right. There are websites out there that will actually tell you this. Let me see if I can type this in. PC. Yeah. Do I have the link on here? There we go. Power supply calculator. Let me go ahead and jump over to this one. So here I can actually go ahead and say I'm an Intel. I am the 8700K. I don't know what motherboard I have. Asus. Oh, it's an ATX motherboard. I have an NVIDIA. I have a 1070 in my motherboard, not a TI. I have one of them. I have, what are my options? I have 16 gigs of RAM. I have one solid state drive in this range. I have two of those, and I have that. So this is saying that I need 371 watts for my power supply. I don't know what I have in my computer, but minimum I need this. So you probably want to go with like a 500 watt at that point. That allows you to have some flexibility. If you said, you know what, I'm going to put another traditional hard drive into my computer. Now you can say I'm at 391. So, or I'm going to update my video card. Let's go to a 2080 Ti instead of my 1070. Now I'm at 521. So now I'm over that 500 watt limit. So there's a lot of games that you want to play here. So when you're thinking about future upgradability. So, but yeah, how big do you need is always going to be the question. All right, when it comes to cooling, there are basically two main types of cooling. You have air and you have water. So down here I have a big air cooler. So there are little heat pipes here that go like right there, which go down to the bottom where there's basically normally a copper pad that distributes the heat from the CPU or GPU out to these things. Those heat pipes come up in here into all these cooling fins, and then we have fans blowing across those cooling fins. All right, so that is a traditional air cooler. Water cooling, this is what's called an AIO, an all-in-one. All right, so we have a little pump here that sits right on top of that copper plate that CPU is attached to, which pumps water through these to a radiator on the back, which again basically is just what we have down here is a whole bunch of little fins that water can go through, and air blows the heat through that radiator, which removes the heat, and then that cool water gets pumped back into that PC or into that pump where that heat sink is, and it just repeats the process over and over and over again. And then the other question when it comes to cooling is case fans. All right, do you want positive pressure? Do you want negative pressure? Or do you want balance pressure? And all that is how many fans do you want pointing in which direction? Everybody has their own opinion on this. I'm not going to tell you which one is best. However, airflow is best. Or if the option is no airflow or airflow, you do need airflow. All right. Otherwise, your computer is going to get awful hot. So you do need case fans to help remove heat from inside of your case. So that is something you do want to think about. All right, peripherals. There are just a list, right? Keyboards, pointing devices, cameras, microphones, touchscreens, speakers, printers, controllers, printers, monitors. I have just a whole big nice picture over here. All right. The list just kind of goes on and on when it comes to peripherals. It's what do you need? What do you like? I have a little 3D mouse over here, which is for my CAD work. I have a normal mouse to my right, which has actually 12 programmable buttons on the side, which allows me to jump through things like, just do this really easily. All right. So that makes my life. My monitor setup is not right. Fun. How do I get back to that screen now? Interesting. Anyway, I need to come through and not that one. That one. Which freaking screen? It's the screen. It's the one I want. Oh, I don't have. That's right. I'm all the way down here. That's why I'm confused. Anyway, the list just kind of goes on, and it really comes down to what do you like, what do you need, those types of things. So I've got a DSLR mounted over me, which is my camera I'm recording with. I've got a microphone sitting right to the next of it. It's a shotgun mic that's meant to go on the DSLR. That's hooked directly to my computer. My 3D mouse, my normal mouse, my keyboard. I have 2.1 surround, not surround, but 2.1 audio system sitting around me. There's a network printer to my right. You know, as I said, I kind of feel like I'm sitting at a command station for something. But, you know, peripherals, lots of the options out there. When it comes to monitors, there are lots of options. All right. Size is probably the biggest one. Is how big of a screen do you want? And then the other big question traditionally is going to be, go back, is LCD or OLED. All right. You might hear LCD/LED. Those are going to both actually be the same exact technology for the actual pixels of themselves. The only big difference there is what's the backlight source. LED are going to obviously have LEDs as backlight. LCD monitors, on the other hand, probably have a fluorescent tube back there providing the black backlighting. So really that's the only real difference between LCD and LED. OLED, on the other hand, which is organic LED, each pixel actually has its own little backlight, which gives you much wider range for blacks and whites, because you're not providing light behind the whole screen, just trying to block it. You're actually lighting each pixel individually. So that's going to be a big difference there. Resolution is made of pixels, so one pixel is one little dot on the screen, and resolution is going to obviously be, another key. The higher resolution traditionally is going to be better, but not always. You only can get so close to your screen, right? So having like a 4K screen on a laptop, you're rarely ever going to see those pixels. Like, that's just too much resolution. 1080p on a laptop, probably fine. All right, because you're never, your screen is small enough that you're not going to see it. Now, if you're running a 55-inch screen and you have like only a 1080p screen, yeah, okay, you might start seeing pixels when you get close enough, but the pixels are big enough. So normally the larger the monitor, the higher the resolution that you're going to want to deal with. Now, projectors are another area that you might be diving into. There's two types of projectors. There's LCD, which basically works just like a TV does, or a monitor does, which the light passes through a prism that divides the light into 3 colored beams, red, green, blue. Those beams are passed through an LCD screen. All right. So you hear that LCD. LCD is liquid crystal display. DLP, on the other hand, is digital light processing, and this uses tiny swiveling mirrors to create an image. All right. So normally they have actually like a spinning disc. I'm just going to do this type of thing. And, this would be red, this would be green, this would be blue, and the light's actually shining through those different colors at different points, and that little mirror is directing the light where it goes. So a little bit different technology, and again, they each have their benefits in the long run. And lastly, we have printers, and there is a full list of printers. Here on the screen is probably one of my favorites, the 3D printer. All right. What you guys will probably see normally, you'll probably see laser, you'll see inkjet. Those are the two most common types of printers out there. All right. This is the one that you probably get for free or extremely cheap with buying a new laptop or something, especially if it's on a college deal or something like that. So inkjet, traditionally inkjet, the printers are going to be extremely cheap, but the cost of ink is going to be very costly. Laser, on the other hand, the lasers are going to cost more, but the toner is going to be extremely cheap. So, you might get thousands of pages. What's the material that used for 3D printers, someone asked. There are probably 3 main types of 3D printer materials. That would be PLA, which is actually corn-based, which I find really interesting. ABS, which is actually the material that football helmets are made out of. And then the other one is called PETG, and I actually have no clue about what PETG is made out of. These two are the most common, I'd say. But PETG is growing rapidly in the long run for popularity, so that's another one. The biggest issue with ABS is it warps when it cools, it shrinks, which causes problems. So a lot of people are a fan of PLA, but ABS is a lot stronger. So there's a lot of give and take going on there. PETG is supposed to kind of be like the winner. It's supposed to be like the super filament. I've never printed with it. If we actually look in my background, we'll see. Let me quick move my camera. Over there, you can see there's a laser engraver and a 3D printer just hanging out in the background. But yeah, so that's the material that 3D printers are using. Most 3D printers, I should say. That's the most common, which is an FDM, which is a fused deposition modeling printer. You also have resin-based and things like that, and we get into some specialty materials. But the laser, the inkjet, and maybe even this all-in-one. And the only thing, an all-in-one can be a laser, an all-in-one can be an inkjet, all right? An all-in-one, the only thing that it includes is a scanner of some sort. So that allows you to scan documents. Normally they can fax documents, copy documents, those types of things. So that's the benefits of the all-in-one. Thermal, you guys actually probably see more often than you expect, but anytime you get a receipt printed at a store, it is a thermal printer. If you want to have some fun, take a heat gun or even a lighter very carefully to the back of one of your receipts, and you'll actually see it turn black because it is a heat-based. This is also why over time they fade. If you ever find like a receipt that's 6 months to a year old, it's a lot lighter in color. Photo is going to be a much higher color type. So it could be an inkjet or dye sublimation. Could connect right to your camera. It's also normally going to be a higher quality printer in the long run. Dye sublimation uses heat to turn solid dye into a gas that is transferred to special paper. Most often, this is a specialty printer line limited to photo printing and other specialized applications. So that's what that is. Whew. And that is the end of chapter 2. All right. I know we had to like burn through that real quickly. Oh, there we go. We can discard all of those. But anyway, that is the end of